Hello, everybody. Dr. F. Scott Field here, and I'd like to introduce you to our newest sponsor. The NPTE Final Frontier is the review course that I wish was around when I took the board exam. For those of you who know my story, it took me a handful of times to pass that exam, and quite frankly, I really wish I had an exam review course around, just like the NPTE Final Frontier. Check out their website, npteff.com, and use the code HET at checkout for 10% off to all of our listeners and fans. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. F. Scott Field, and I've got with me longtime friend, basically somebody I've known for years now and had the pleasure of working with recently, too, Dr. Craig Bowen. Craig, how are you, man? Tell us a little bit about your educational journey and how it's led you to where you're at today.
Yeah, the conversation is going to be about the House of Delegates, and I'm here now. I'm in DC. Things are starting to kick off already. I'll be in meetings here soon, but my educational journey, it wasn't very straightforward, I guess. I'm like a lot of people that didn't have a traditional route getting into physical therapy, didn't have the GPA, so to speak, and I had to leverage everything possible to get in. So I had a 2.75 GPA. I've shared that story. There's a blog post out there that's had 50,000 views or something like that now. But I basically leveraged everything I could to bolster my resume to get in, and I really used that story of that's how bad I wanted to be in this profession. And ultimately, I'm really happy to be here. I think that has really anchored me in wanting to constantly contribute. I feel like I owe a debt not only to the people that helped me, but to the future leaders that are coming up, but also to the profession. I really wanted to be here, and now I'm lucky to be one of the voices in the profession that helps on deciding the future of it.
Yeah, I mean, you and I share a lot in common, and I think one of them is that kind of GPA / non-traditional path to physical therapy school, right? I mean, I was an English major before I went into physical therapy school. And again, my GPA wasn't the greatest. But I think, being a little bit different and, being able to communicate effectively and write and read, pretty well and, interview pretty well. I think that really helped me, get into PT school as a little bit maybe outside the box candidate, and luckily, both you and I now have had pretty decent careers, and we've been fortunate enough to have opportunities to give back to the profession and to give back to those that helped us in the future. So like you said, today we're talking about House of Delegates, obviously very timely. This is all going on right now. Why don't you start us off by just telling us a little bit about what the House of Delegates is? Tell us what APTA's HOD is and what they do.
Yeah, ultimately the House of Delegates is essentially like one of our governing bodies of the profession. So you can think about the House of Delegates is kind of like almost your Congress. Every state has a representative here at some level, and I can talk more about that. But then you also have your kind of executive branch. You have your president, board of directors, all that stuff. And between the two, these two parties have to collaborate in one way to basically determine where we're going and what we're doing. The House of Delegates kind of formulates everything, and then your executive branch, quote unquote, is the ones going out there and figuring out how we're going to do it, or maybe even providing recommendations back to the House. Look, this is what we're seeing. This is what we're gathering information on, and then giving us recommendations on how we can put policy or different bylaws and stuff like that into place to kind of shape things. When you look at the state by state stuff, that's what I was saying with regards to the House of Delegates. The House of Delegates has each state has a certain amount of delegates, and that's based on percentage membership within each state, APTA membership within each state. So I can think about a small state. I was looking at it today, actually. Small states like Delaware, New Mexico, Vermont, they only have 2 delegates. They have a chief delegate, and they have somebody else that's another pairing delegate. So every state has at least 2 minimum. And then they might have alternate delegates. Say right now, right, somebody gets COVID, they can't come to House of Delegates, the alternate would step in and come to the House of Delegates. There might even be instances this weekend, where somebody might not have come just because it just happened today, so that the chief delegate would have to carry their vote. So those types of things happen. I'm in Texas. We have 25 delegates. Now, in Texas, it's done by districts. So for me, I think there's probably about 18 districts. I'm a district delegate. So my district elected me to represent our district at the House of Delegates for Texas, right? But there's also at-large delegates because we have more delegates than districts. So those terms are only 1 year. Now that's how we do it in Texas. It might be done differently. I was a delegate in New Jersey for 2 years. That was a 2-year term too, but I wasn't elected by the district. I was just elected by the APTA members of New Jersey as a whole. So every state has differences, but essentially that's the gist of it. In 2020, I believe, we elected to have section vote. So each section that you have, orthopedics, geriatrics, neurology, whatever, education, every section that's in the APTA now has 2 votes. So we decided to expand the House of Delegates. At some level, it's a little maybe controversial because now when you expand, your vote actually shrinks, right? Your percentage isn't as good as it was prior to the expansion. So that was maybe an argument against it, but ultimately, I think it's important to have those individuals voting. So I voted for that at that time. Previously, they would just provide advice to the House of Delegates. So they would have representatives in the room during the House of Delegates. If there was a topic concerning their certain section, they might come to the microphone and say, this is our perspective on it. But now they actually can do that and get a vote on it. And last year, the PTAs basically were in a similar situation. They called it the PTA caucus. The PTA caucus had their little group of PTAs that I think they were elected, or maybe they're volunteers, but I think they were elected. And they would come in, kind of give their perspective on the microphone, but they didn't have a vote. We voted last year to that they would have 2 votes this year. So now the sections have 2 votes, PTAs have 2 votes too. So that's something that's fairly new to the House of Delegates. I was trying to do a count. I think it's about 440 votes now total, something like that. Previously, it was closer to about like 402, 403, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Very cool. That's a pretty good layout of the bigger picture of the House of Delegates and what it is and what it does. Tell me a little bit about why is it important? Why is the House of Delegates important? Why do you feel it's important? What is the reasoning behind trying to get into the House of Delegates or supporting it, so to speak?
Yeah, when you look at the House of Delegates, and this, we all know about our state practice acts. The House of Delegates essentially is setting the whole umbrella practice act for our nation. So that's what the House of Delegates is doing. So if there's something that's not in there, for instance, we had a motion, I think, in 2020 to kind of make either we added telehealth or we expanded. I can't remember specifically, but there was a telehealth motion in there. So that way we're covering ourselves from a practice act standpoint nationally to have telehealth included in there. We don't want to be self-limiting to our own profession. And that's why it's important. Now, state to state, you still have to follow your state practice act. And there's going to be derivations of whatever, because your local legislators are going to vote on that stuff. But as a whole, the APTA kind of sets the standard of what's going on. So there could be certain things like that. There's a lot of, sometimes it'll directly impact you, sometimes it won't. The one motion that Texas is working on this year is talking about accommodations for learning. Well, I don't want to call it a learning disability, but if you need accommodations for testing accommodations, right? That's one of the things right now that Texas is putting forward. We're working on. I'll give a mention to Katie Franklin. She's in San Antonio with me down there. She's the one that really brought this to Texas' attention, and now we're trying to bring this motion forward to the whole of the House of Delegates. But basically, there's discrepancies between testing accommodations from state to state. So maybe you had testing accommodations in a certain state because of your university standards, and now all of a sudden you're going to a different state for a different board, and there's different testing accommodations. So something like that should be fairly uniform, but we don't think about those types of things. And it was brought to somebody's attention. Maybe it was brought to Katie's attention. I'm not sure how it went, but it got brought to a delegate's attention. Now we're working forward on a motion to make this happen, that basically the language will be there. Now, what are the next steps to make this happen? Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it doesn't.
So I guess my next question is, what does it look like? Walk us through like a day in the life of a House of Delegate person. Like what does your schedule look like for the next couple of days? Kind of walk
Yeah,
us through what that is.
for sure. So I got in here this afternoon, and then there's a keynote speaking thing going on actively right now. Then I'm bypassing, but then after that we'll meet as a delegation to Texas, and I think most delegations will be meeting tonight. So you'll probably have dinner of some sort, and you'll be talking about what's the game plan tomorrow and that kind of stuff. Then we wake up early in the morning. Our delegation again is meeting at 7 o'clock. So we'll have breakfast. We'll meet as a delegation to talk about stuff. Now, what are we talking about? Some of it might just be the game plan, like, hey, this is what we're doing. Now we've already been talking about our schedule, but you just never know how things might shift. But language in these motions is actively being changed right now. There will be motions that'll be on the floor tomorrow that, as a whole, we've heard everybody come to the microphone and we've agreed that we like the motion, but the language doesn't work. Now, why doesn't the language work? Well, language matters, words matter. Basically, if a word could mean something but imply something else. So you have to be careful with that. Not only that, you have to be careful that your language matches previous motions, because you don't want it to undercut the language of something else and maybe open this wormhole or Pandora's box in this other area, which we didn't intend to at all. So luckily, there's a lot of people that are really well versed in that language that can provide guidance and that kind of stuff. Those kind of questions always come up. The current, I will just stay with this bill for Texas, this motion for Texas. One of the things was called reasonable accommodations, right? That was originally in the thing. Now reasonable has gotten taken out and it's gotten put into something more specific. So there's all these different things, but essentially we'll meet tomorrow. Then the House itself, I can tell you right now, the House itself will meet for a couple hours. So tomorrow the House meets from 8:30 to 11:30. Then you'll break for lunch. So then we'll meet as a delegation again. We'll grab lunch, then we'll come back. House of Delegates will then go from 1 to 5. We'll have dinner tomorrow night. We might meet as a delegation a little bit, but right now my delegation doesn't seem like it's meeting, and we're going to have dinner. And then again, it starts back up. So 7:15, we're in a room doing breakfast. Then House of Delegates 8:30 to 11:30, and then it goes from 1 to 3, and then it'll end there. So all business needs to be done in that time period. If it doesn't get seen, it doesn't get seen. The agenda is kind of set right now, but if we felt like something was at the bottom of the agenda that was more of a priority, we could vote to have that reordered to the top. And I believe it takes a 2/3 vote to do something like that. So there's different rules. We follow Robert's rules. There's all these different rules that we have to follow. And as a new delegate, that might be kind of confusing. This is my 5th year as a delegate, so I'm a little more well-versed in understanding some of these processes.
So let's talk about that. You talked about new delegates. If somebody's interested in becoming a delegate, what does that process look like? How should they go about trying to get involved in House of Delegates?
So I definitely can speak to a state delegation. I don't really want to speak to a section delegate because I'm not sure exactly what these sections have in place, but just know that option's out there if you want to be a section delegate. It might be harder in certain certain sections than others, but that option's out there. For states, definitely contact people within your state. So within the TPTA, and they'll be able to direct you. Now, for me in New Jersey, I was a student that was active in the APTA. So I was kind of groomed along the process of it. So when it came time to nominate people, somebody approached me about it. I was already interested in that as a student, so it wasn't a big deal for me to say yes. And they nominated me, and I had to go through the election process. In Texas, I didn't know anybody, so for me, I had to go from a completely new territory. Now, in Texas, we actually have 2 elections. We have your district election, and then we have the at-large elections. So when I had reached out, I had actually missed the at-large. So the only option I had was to run for my district. Luckily, I had won that election. But that's basically what you would do. You would talk to somebody in the TPTA. You can email anybody over there, or I'm saying TPTA, but anybody in your state association, and they would totally be able to direct you in the right direction. But you definitely have to be mindful of the times. I assume most people will need to have, so most delegations will probably be elected people right after this. So, as soon as House of Delegates ends, you need to be on top of it because the cycle could be starting soon. Now, with the House of Delegates, it used to be in June every year. Now it's right now in August the past 2 years, maybe even 3 years now. So it's kind of messing with the timelines of things a little bit, but it varies state to state. Every state does everything. Well, there could be similarities, but sometimes it could be different for state to state. But reach out to them; they'll be able to guide you in the right direction. Even if you don't win your election or get not elected or whatever, don't get discouraged by that, because there's plenty of times where what we consider alternate delegates, these are individuals that were slated that didn't get nominated or didn't get elected. Those individuals will still sit sometimes. So Texas, I think every year we have at least 3 or 4 alternates that get moved into the House of Delegates and are here. So depending on your size of your state, you could have pretty high turnover with alternates getting in there. So don't get discouraged. It's easy to, feel like you didn't win the election, maybe because people didn't know who you were. You didn't have maybe certain credentials that people were looking for, but you could still get slid into that House of Delegates. And you could get the call like the week of. So, it's one of those things where you're on standby, but you'll be attending all the meetings and all that stuff. So that's still useful to hear all that, because your state delegation is going to hold local meetings. Like we hold monthly meetings. So you're still getting versed into it because it's all through repetition. There's a lot of new stuff that happens with this. So it's still good to get the practice and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, Craig, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out and educating our audience into all things House of Delegates and what that looks like and why it's important, and the advocacy part of things and how to get involved. We're going to leave you with this one final question we ask all of our guests. If you could change one aspect of higher education, whether it be DPT or otherwise, what aspect would you change? How would you change it, and why?
Yeah, I think, as my journey started, right, it wasn't easy. Like it was a very big uphill battle for me to get into grad school. I finally got there. I worked my tail off. I did a lot of like APTA stuff at that point in time. And then I finally got my career, and my career was pretty easy when I first started. But as I've worked in this profession, I feel like there's challenges ahead for all of us. And I don't know what those challenges are for you or for anybody, but I just know that it's become challenging at times, whether it's, your caseload or dealing with insurance companies or just handling this idea of maybe decreased schedule flexibility or whatever it is. There's going to be like certain psychological aspects that come into your life that are going to make this career challenging at times. And I think we're all here for the right reasons. We want to help people, but sometimes I think it's easy to forget about ourselves. And I'm not turning this into a self-care piece by any means, but I think we need to like have part of our education is setting the expectation that this job might not be easy. It might be tough. It might be hard. And that's the nature of patient care. And I don't say that as a physical therapist. I say that as a healthcare professional, because it's happening to doctors, it's happening to dentists, it's happening to nurses, it's happening to eye doctors. You listen to the amount of people that are in healthcare right now, and I don't want to say there's a mass exodus, but there's people exiting because of the work demand. So I think we need to start preparing people for the understanding that this might be tough. And there's different levels of tough. And I think it's maybe just part of maybe a part of a course, not even at an actual course, but just having this piece of, hey, this is what's out there. This is what to expect. Maybe it's just sharing different experiences about it. Even in one of the hospitals I worked in a neurology unit, or they had a neurology unit there. And a lot of those conditions are degenerative, right? As clinicians, we get energy from getting people better, and that population doesn't really get better. So they had like a support group of just conversations just to help those clinicians. So that way they weren't taking on that burden, right? Like that's not my example. That's somebody else's life, right? But you just never know what's going to come up into your thing. Maybe there's work challenges. In 2020, I was out of work for a long time. So like, you just never know. But I think some of these things, just understanding that healthcare is hard, and setting that expectation up front. It's not all rainbows and butterflies. And I think the people that are at the House of Delegates understand that. We're working on trying to make that future better. But at the end of the day, it's going to take hard work to get the changes happen. It's not going to just happen overnight. We have legislators that are involved in our profession that don't even know what we do. So there's always going to be an uphill battle for physical therapy. So if we're setting that expectation in the classroom, I think we're just all going to be better served for it.
Yeah, I mean, grit, perseverance, and mental fortitude. I think we definitely need to up that game after COVID. That's for sure. 2020 was brutal on everyone. So I think we can come a little better prepared for the next big thing,
Sure.
Craig, thank you so much for your time, man. I can't say how much we appreciate you coming on. Where can people reach out to you if they have any more questions about House of Delegates or how to get involved, or just follow up with what you're up to these days?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. Craig P. Bowen is probably the easiest way to reach out to me. The blog post that I was referencing, if people wanted to go, it was like an experimental blog I did, was DPT perspective. I don't write on that, and at some level it has some personal development stuff that I was experimenting with. But overall, those are the two places. If people wanted to go and check out my story, they can check it out there. The story was called Pre-PT Hacks, 8 Ways to Increase Your Acceptance Rate. But if they want to reach out, find me on Twitter. That's my primary social media. I don't use Facebook or anything like that.
Awesome, man. We'll put those links in the show notes. Craig, always a pleasure, man. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.